Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's late Thursday morning, so I think there's enough time for everybody to get their questions in. So let's jump in and see what we got. First up, on Floatplane, Shorjor said their cousin is borrowing a CRT of theirs and he wants to hook it up to his PC. He's currently using one of those generic scalers that takes 720p or 1080p in and downscales it to 15 kilohertz to output composite. It's not the best, but it fits his current needs of a monitor running YouTube. They've been trying to cobble together which solutions are the best, and it seems that the best is using custom resolution utility and adapters. He has an RTX 4080, so using that directly isn't possible. So using a DisplayPort to VGA adapter and then a VGA to SCART from Retro Upgrades is likely the best way to do this. Do I have any recommendations for DisplayPort to VGA adapters that support 15 kilohertz? Do I have any other considerations to keep in mind? He's only using his PC for this, so avoiding scalers would be the best. Perhaps getting an older video card like the ATI ones with S-Video could work, and would it be possible to have all the rendering be on the 4080 and then just pass through the PCI bus to the ATI card, which would then output 240p or 480i? So I'm not sure if I have the exact answer for you. Excuse me, but I think I could at least point you in the right direction. So to answer your questions directly, I've never used a DisplayPort to VGA adapter that I remember. If I did, it was for an experiment that worked. Otherwise, I wouldn't have, I would definitely remember it if there were huge issues. So I just don't have a recommendation for that. Now, you could do an HDMI to VGA adapter. However, I'm not sure how it would work in a PC scenario, but I will link to the ones that Kuro tested that I believe work with Mr. Direct Video, so it should then work with a PC. And if you want to use that, custom resolution utility and some others might be able to work. You might just have to send it what, I don't know why, but it's nicknamed super resolution. So instead of 320 by 240 for 240p, it would be like 1920 by 240. I'm not sure how 480i would work, but I don't know if video cards would even be able to do that if you wanted 480i out. And if you just need 480i, one of those cheap converters might actually just be perfect, the ones that you already are using. But let me keep going. Next, do I have any other considerations to keep in mind? Yeah, the number one factor is, unless you have a dedicated setup like Groovy Arcade, forcing your PC to have a 15 kilohertz output on one of the video card's outputs just always causes issues. Always. Now, I'm sure there's people listening that will rightfully say, no, you're an idiot. I do this all the time. And I'm sure you do, but I and many, many, many other people have always had problems. And it could be driver revisions. It could be combination of hardware. It could be a lot of stuff. But the biggest issue I've personally had is, even if I'm able to play with stuff and get it working, it doesn't work again after rebooting. I have to start from scratch and remess with all the settings. So it was never reliable for me that way, which is why I've always thought that setting one output to like 640 by 480 and then using a downscaler from there would actually be a really good choice. I do realize you mentioned you don't want to get a scaler, probably to save money, which makes perfect sense to me. So I would just kind of consider your total cost. How much are all of these converters going to be? How much would another video card be? And that brings me to the last question you had. I have no idea, but I would also love to know, if you have a dual GPU scenario with one that's very powerful and one that's just old and not powerful, how can you make sure that it's doing all of the processing through the main GPU and only sending the video through the older and crappier one? Is that even possible? Is that a thing that people could do? I would love to know the answer to that, because that could certainly be a solution for many people. What I would also love is just a USB 3 or 3.1 or 3.2 adapter that just outputs video over maybe even just a VGA port that you could force setting it to 240p or 480i. I would really love that, because I don't think you'd be limited by USB 3.0 bandwidth for that kind of, even the lossless, RGB color space video. I don't think USB 3 is even close to the max for 15 kilohertz signals. So I think that is something I've always wanted to know, is, are there any USB video cards out there that could do this? Because that would just solve a lot of people's problems. But All of that said, going through all your question, I think what you might end up having to do is set the output to 640 by 480, which as long as it's 31 kilohertz, that should actually be something that persists and works fine. But then use some kind of downscaler to get into your CRT, and that's when you would just check the downscaling section of the website and pick which one works for you. So, does anybody listening have a solution for this? Do you have any suggestions? I read all of the comments in these, and very often there are amazing suggestions that I never thought of, and also very often there are suggestions that I've tested and they just don't work. And I try to respond to all of them with positivity, but I still like hearing them. So thank you very much for everybody that participates and helps out with these. But yeah, all great questions, and let's see what everybody else is doing with it. But if it were me personally, I would try messing with PC settings and try using that HDMI to VGA converter to see if I can get 480i working, because that's an awesome device anyway, and you could definitely use it for 640 by 480. So I would start there, but I probably would end up using a downscaler at the end of the day. One more from Shorzor. He has some CRTs that only have SCART inputs and are building a setup around an Extron Crosspoint 24 by 24. They'd like to have them all hooked up to the Crosspoint, but they're having trouble finding BNC to SCART cables with resistors to get the sync voltage to a safe level, and also inputting blanking signals. That's for anybody who uses a PAL CRT with a SCART input. You need voltage on the SCART line in order to tell the CRT to use that port and what input to use and what aspect ratio and yada yada. So do I know of any cables for this purpose? So there's a couple of things. First of all, the SCART Sense Injector from Consoles for You takes a USB input and just feeds it power on those SCART pins. So this is the exact scenario in which you would want to use it. However, there is no resistor on the sync line. Now, I talked to Jan when I read your question, also because somebody else was asking the exact same thing, and I suggested he make a revision that has a switch on it that defaults to resistor on, because the worst thing that could happen if you don't need it on is you don't get a signal, but there's no damage to anything. So he said he'd look into it, but it would require a completely different revision. So that's not going to be a solution for you right now. It might be in the future. And that also makes sense because this is a super common scenario in which you would want to use something like that. However, actually, maybe you could even make a version with BNC inputs for this exact reason. I'll mention that to Jan as well. A BNC to SCART with the resistor on the line and the voltage. I'll talk to him. But for now, I would just contact any cable manufacturer that does this, because most scenarios of going BNC out to SCART, to a SCART device would require this. So it's weird that that's not something you could find from any custom cable makers. But check the eBay seller, I think WookieWin. I bought a bunch of cables from them over the years, and I never had issues in the past couple of years. And I did ask for custom stuff, like add a resistor to the SCART line type of thing. So that would probably be a good place to start. And then you could just buy the SCART Sense injectors as they are, and just make sure you use a BNC to SCART cable with the resistor on the sync line, and you're good to go. So I'll mention that to Jan just in case as well, but we'll see what we could do for now. And hopefully that's a good enough solution for you to be able to do it. Worst comes to worst, if you just buy BNC to SCART cables, make sure the direction is correct. You should just be able to pop open the SCART head, desolder the sync line, put a resistor in its place, and then solder the sync line to the resistor. It is, working on SCART cables is a pain, but it's totally doable for beginners. You just have to have some patience, and then either cover that in heat shrink tubing or even just black tape, something to make sure it doesn't short on the pins next to it. But it is doable if you need to do it yourself. Now, moving over to Patreon, ProNerdy said they love using their APC sine wave UPS on their desktop setup. And they have a PC, 2 monitors, an HDMI switch, an Ethernet switch, some game consoles connected at the moment. And they'd also like to plug in that Rosenway 10-way USB port that I reviewed a while back that I'm still using, and I have been ever since. But they're wondering, how could they plug more stuff into it? Should they get another UPS? Their room's outlets are all on the same 120 volt, 15 amp at 1800 watt breaker, but they don't think they'd run into a situation where two UPSs are all at maxed wattage and hit the breaker. So I would actually first start by figuring out what the maximum potential wattage of your current setup is. Because people are going to remember, while it's not good practice to use a bunch of splitters into a UPS, at the end of the day, if you're only powering on the normal amount of stuff at one time that doesn't max out the UPS, you could have 1,000 things connected to it. But if only a couple are on at the same time and none go past the UPS's limits, then it's not a problem at all. But that's something you'll want to check because I have two UPSs. I have a really good one hooked up to my server and all of my Ethernet equipment. And then I had an extra one. So I said, let me just plug it into my PC just so I could, have some extra protection. And randomly, everything would shut off because the PC was like rendering something in Premiere and it hit the max wattage of the UPS and shut it off. So that's definitely the first thing I would check. You said it's the APC 1500 VA version. I would double check to see how much total potential wattage could your PC with two monitors be drawing. The matrix switches and stuff like that in game consoles or the Nintendo Switch at least are going to be very low wattage in comparison, but like a PS5 and the newer Xbox might draw quite a bit. So start by that. Start by totaling the maximum potential draw and see if that maxes out your UPS. If that's the case, then I would first start by saying, what do you really need hooked up with power or with battery protection, not just regular power protection? PC, one monitor, and any of the switches in the USB hub would probably be it. And then everything else, unless you're a pro gamer or you're in the middle of a game that you love and you want to make sure the UPS stays on just for a few seconds for you to save it, I guess I could see that. But try with the bare minimum and then just look into anything else. But if you need two UPSs, I would double check exactly what you already have the specs of. Does the breaker that you have it connected to, is that going to max out by plugging all of this stuff into it? Now, that said, if it is going to max out plugging all this stuff into it, you should really look into having an electrician take a look at this and see, can you even run all of this stuff in one room? So my server is very, very low powered. So it's not like it's a cranked, high powered server that's always doing processing. It's essentially a file server. So I'm not at all worried. But the way my house is very weirdly wired, one of the power lines goes all the way through the house and connects all the bedrooms. So if I just happen to have like a server in every bedroom or something like that, or a really high powered gaming PC, I would actually have to probably cut holes in the walls and have different wires run to compensate for that if I wanted to do it. So that's obviously pretty extreme and not everybody's going to need something like that anyway. But I would kind of just say, if you really have a fear of plugging too many things in for your power, your actual breaker, call an electrician to double check, but just start at the beginning. How much can your UPS handle? What's the total draw? And if you're not hitting the max, then just get a standard power surge protector splitter thing and use that to connect everything. And while no, it's not the best practice, it's not at all something that you would need to worry about compared to lots of other things. And if I'm wrong here, if I'm forgetting something, if a power expert's listening and being like, you moron, you forgot about this, please tell me. I would hate to give misinformation, but I'm pretty sure in the scenario that you're discussing right now, it's not going to be a problem. So, do a little more research. Let me know what you find, and hopefully this is just as easy as either getting a second UPS or maybe just getting a surge protector for this one to add more stuff to the backed up ports. But great question. Next up, Daniel Yochana is trying to help a friend play his CPS3 arcade board on both a CRT and stream at the same time. The arcade board is a CPS3 that's connected with the AshenWorks Supergun Mini. From the Supergun, he has a VGA to SCART cable directed to his CRT. So I'm assuming it's an RGB SCART PAL CRT. Daniel lent him his 10x3 SCART switch splitter, the Otaku Store one, and from there he splits it into a basic upscaler and then to a capture card. Are there any 1x2 SCART splitters that are safe to use? He has no other SCART sources, and he's not planning on adding any, and the only options they could find are like the 10x3, but that's pretty overkill for his use. Any other solution would be great as well. They want to find the best option for it. So my answer to you is money. What's the cheapest? I believe there's one SCART splitter out there that some friends of mine have used. I have not personally tested it, but it should be okay. But I don't know what it would cost versus the sub $100 Otaku store switch. So if you find a really good splitter that's 125 and then the switch is 100, I would just get the cheaper one. And yeah, it's bigger and it's overkill, but I'd rather have you do that than have you spend extra money. So I'll I'll leave links to all of that as well. The other thing is I got to just remind you of is none of these super guns that I know of output SCART level sync on the VGA port. So it's always not even recommended. I mean, it's a safety warning that when you're using VGA to SCART cables, to have a 470 ohm-ish, give or take, resistor on the sync line on the SCART head. So hopefully the cable that your friend is using has that built in, or they could eventually damage their CRT or whatever other SCART device they use in between. So if everything's working, it probably is fine, but I would double check just to make absolutely sure. But yeah, I mean, I would just go by that. I think there's a bunch of other projects out there that might be a help, but I think they're open source and you'd have to make or modify one of them. Like the one I just talked about is the one from Kaitor. That's an open source product that one of the outputs is BNC. So then you'd have to buy that, or you'd actually have to make it. They're out of stock because it's just an open source product. And then you'd have to buy a BNC to VGA cable. And if you already have all of these other things and all you need is one device in the middle, once again, going back to the Otaku store switch might be a cheaper option. So I would take a total look at everything and see what you could do. But I agree, we need more open source stuff like that in stock someplace. And I think that's important because a lot of people need this, but the problem is we're not going to sell thousands of these. So for me to ask a store, can you stock them? They would have to either hand make them, and then they'd be very expensive, and then sit on a shelf for years, or they would have to have a bulk order made somewhere at a manufacturer and have a ton of them sit on shelves for years as they slowly trickled out. So I'm working on trying to find an interim solution for this, but for now, I'll leave a whole bunch of links, including a review of the AshenWorks Supergun Mini, just to reference for anybody curious of what that is. It's great, but all superguns need to be used with caution, just because that's the nature of the beast. But great questions. Hopefully I steered you in the right direction. Next up, Oliver Clare has an easy question, but a really cool scenario that I want to talk about. So I'll go through this question because I think this is something other people might be interested in, even if it doesn't apply to their house. It's a cool ass scenario. So Oliver's been working on optimizing their home network for low latency PS5 streaming within the house, partly to better manage the kids' screen time and partly to keep them away from the more irreplaceable parts of Oliver's absolutely amazing retro setup in the new office. Right now, they're using PS Remote Play to stream their PS5 from the office to a 4K Google TV streamer in the living room. Both devices are hardwired via in-wall Cat 6A and running through Unify gear, so network-related lag is basically a non-factor. And Oliver took the time to add up all of the different latencies. So the PS5's encoding, network transmission, Google TV streamer, the DualSense Bluetooth to Google TV streamer, the living room TV in game mode. So right now their total latency the total latency is 40 to 50 milliseconds, which is pretty solid for a local streaming setup, especially with modern consoles that generally are more latency from button push to movement on screen anyway. I'm oversimplifying. If Nigel Whittle's listening, please don't jump through the screen and punch me in the face. I know. Just saying, in general, it's going to be easier to deal with that than it would for like an NES playing Tetris. But Oliver's also thinking about adding a Philips Hue sync box in the living room to enhance movies and casual gaming, but I've read that it adds 12 milliseconds of lag, which makes sense, because you have to read a full frame in order to figure out what the lighting should be, which could push their total latency over 60 milliseconds, making it more noticeable in fast-paced games. So to get the best of both worlds, Oliver wants to use a small zero-latency splitter to send the Google TV streamer signal to both the Hue sync box and directly to their living room TV, allowing him to bypass the sync box for low latency gaming while still using it for immersive lighting when needed. So, to answer your question, the same splitter I've been recommending for years is the same one that's going to be fine for this. It does max out at 4K 60, but it has been rock solid. Now, I've tested a lot of HDMI equipment, some of which lasted a year and died. I still leave the recommendations up on the site because we're talking about sub $20 boxes, and I'm always very blunt about that. If you want the good stuff, you got to spend $150. But if you had to buy one of those every couple of years, it'd be many years before you came up to the same amount of money as the good stuff. So it's up to you. But the one that I'm talking about is many years old and is still solid, and I have a bunch of them. So I'll leave a link to that for anybody who's interested. I think it's the same design, because remember, when things are made in bulk like this, every manufacturing revision could change. But I haven't had anybody reach out and let me know, and you awesome people often do when that happens, which I appreciate always. So that's a safe one. But easy answer to the question, but what an interesting question, because if you have the scenario of kids casual gaming in a different room, I think you've done everything that you possibly can. Now, the Philips Hue Sync box, that's interesting because that's one of those things that I was always curious about. I generally don't like distractions, so if I were ever able to do that, I would want to turn it down to the lowest setting. And I'm also curious, do Philips TVs, which are not available in the US, but available to you, I think, do the ones that have the Ambilight built in, does that actually add any kind of latency to it? Or because it's built into the TV, does it do the splitting of it somewhere else? I don't know. That's really interesting. So I think at the very least, splitting it between different solutions might help when you have many things connected to one. So like in Oliver's scenario, the main PS5 split that before going to the Ambilight, so all of that stuff isn't added along with everything else. I don't know. That's a great one. Has anybody else messed with that? I think Chris Majestic, the YouTuber, I think he's done a whole bunch of videos on both the Ambilight, but also the do-it-yourself versions that are really cool. But I don't remember him ever mentioning latency. So that's something I'm interested in just out of curiosity. But yeah, very awesome question. Super easy answer, but there's so much more to that. I'd love to dig into that someday. But for now, I'll just leave it to the comments if anybody has thoughts on it. Next up, Dustin Madison is trying to poison me. Dustin said, just some advice for you. If I think I might need cough syrup for myself, but the pharmacy isn't available or the doctor's office isn't open, try the Dr. McGillicuddy. It's a schnapps that's really cheap. It tastes exactly like cough syrup, has the same exact effects of cough syrup, and is cheaper than cough syrup. Their mom, who's a nurse, mind you, would use it in place of syrup when they were sick as a kid, and it really works. Personally recommend the cherry or grape flavor. So first of all, that is hysterical. I used to drink Jägermeister a lot as a kid until I realized one day that I was just too old and it was weird for an old guy to be ordering Jaeger at the bar. But that was pretty cough syrupy as well, to be honest with you. No one ever gave that to me as a kid. I just discovered it when I read Metallica talking about Jägermeister in a magazine when I was a kid and went on a hunt to go find somebody dumb enough to buy it for me, which I did, of course. But yeah, that's hysterical. First of all, cough syrup doesn't ever actually work on me unless it's the one prescription one. And I've tried it for years. And one of my doctors, one of the good ones years ago, was like, most cough syrups are total bullshit. They coat your throat and make you feel better for a couple of minutes, and that's it. Now, there's other stuff in them for other things, of course, but talking for an actual respiratory problem, they're mostly BS. So I actually believe that your Dr. McGillicuddy poison might really help the same way cough syrup sort of does for a few minutes. But I think that would just bring me straight back into when I was in my late teens and enjoyed drinking, but still had the palate of a kid. So I would drink like Goldschlager and all that, super sweet, gross stuff. But I'll leave a link to your poison in the description for anybody who's curious. And thank you for sharing. And that is absolutely hilarious. And if I do run into it at a liquor store one day, I'm going to buy one and I'm going to make my friend Patrick drink it with me just so we could both experience this. And I will absolutely get back to you if I do. So thanks for the suggestion. Next up, YRock recently got a PC CRT monitor from a flea market and they want to integrate it into their setup, but there's a few points they're unsure of. For reference, it's a 2003 ADI Microscan V70, and they haven't been able to find any manuals online yet. So I'm sure it's just a generic VGA PC CRT monitor, which means as long as the screen isn't all yellowed or discolored, it's awesome. So let's continue. At the moment, they're just using the cheapest HDMI to VGA converter they could get while they made sure the monitor worked and whatnot. Would there be quality or compatibility issues using that, or should they look into getting a better one? I would spend the money on a better one because you can get a really good one for less than $10. Now, this is normally the point where I would say, just if what you're using is fine, stick with it. But $10 and you want to go down the rabbit hole of integrating this into your setup. Now you could use this backup Walmart one, which might be fine, but who knows? So I personally would waste the $10 just in case. It's the same one that I linked to before that Kuro did the analysis of. I'll post a link again. I'll post the same link twice just to make it easier for everybody. But yeah, I would. And next, would there be any quality differences generally between setting one of their consoles to 480p directly or sending them through the Tink 5X downscaling set to 480p? So a general rule of analog video signals is everything that you put in the chain will lower the quality. Now, while that is a fact, can you see the difference? Would you require an oscilloscope and blowing it up 100 times to 50K resolution in order to see it? Or is it something you're actually going to see with your eyes? That's going to be up to you. But for ease of use, I would always try to set your consoles directly to 480p and see what happens. If they don't support 4:3 resolutions, if everything's off and you need a bunch of different things to change around, if you want to add different consoles to it, and there's a lot of stuff that you might want to try especially if you already own a Tink 5X, which it sounds like you do. So yeah, I would try both and then see where you think you're going to use it the most. You could find that you're really just going to leave it plugged into your Dreamcast and nothing else, or just your PC and nothing else. Or you could find that it's going to be your main monitor that you use even retro consoles through, using the Tink 5X to line double them, yada, 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 all the stuff I always talk about. So try it first. The Tink 5X isn't going to lower the signal quality, but it's one more thing in the chain that could go wrong. So always just use it if you need to, or if there's any of those other scenarios. And lastly, what resolutions would a PC monitor of the time support? So 640 by 480 at 60 hertz should be supported by every single PC CRT, VGA monitor, if you want to call it. But every one of them can support a wide variety of different resolutions and refresh rates. And I would start testing some of these out. Spoiler alert, I have a video that I'm working on that I'm hoping to get done soon that talks exactly about using the Tink 4Ks to output odd resolutions for PC CRT monitors, which you could do the same with just a standard PC as well. But you could do stuff like run it at 640 by 480 at 120 hertz or stuff like that. Or depending on the monitor, you can go pretty high. So I would start with 640 by 480 at 60, especially if you're connecting a PC, and just go from there. Try 800 by 600 60 hertz, 1024 by 768, and keep moving up until you find a limit. Same thing with the refresh rates if you want anything else like that. So I would definitely just kind of give it a try and see what happens. But I don't, and also if you send it an incompatible resolution, that's always a weird thing that I'm not sure of. So the monitor that I got here that my buddy Chris sold me a while back that I love, a Gateway 2000 Vivitron, if you send it 1080p, it just says a signal out of range. And that's it. It doesn't hurt the monitor. It doesn't make a weird high-pitched sound where it's trying to send it out of spec. But not every monitor has protection on it. So you could potentially harm your monitor if you send it an incompatible resolution. So what I would do is, I would start by just doing the basics and keep stepping up until you find its limit. But have your hand on the VGA cable ready to go. So if you hear crazy sounds when it switches resolutions, just yank the cable out and don't even mess with it. But if you switch resolutions and it very calmly and simply says resolution not supported, I would feel safe trying a bunch of different combinations just to see what happens. Is it the same worries as when using a 15 kilohertz CRT and sending a wrong resolution? So it could be, but it wouldn't be something that... So the scenario that you're talking about is you have a PC connected to a Sony PVM, right? And if that PC boots in 640 by 480 at 60 hertz, and then you kick in whatever software you have running to send down to 15 kilohertz, that means every time you boot the CRT, you're sending the wrong resolution to that PVM. So doing it once or twice shouldn't hurt anything. I mean, I would avoid it if possible, but doing it every time you power up your PC could absolutely wear on it a little bit too much. So while no, it's not the same. So yes, it's the same exact worry, but it's not the same scenario. Because once you figure out what resolutions that it can and can't support, don't send it anything else and you never have to worry again. So in the context of connecting a PC, you could feel free just trying it, have that hand on the VGA cable just in case, and just kind of go from there. So I think I was able to kind of answer everything, but honestly, I couldn't possibly encourage anybody more to do exactly what you're doing. You find a cheap PC VGA monitor, take it home and play with it. Hook it up to your PC, hook it up to your consoles, buy just the cheap HDMI to VGA converter and go from there. And I think you'll find some pretty interesting uses for it, including TV shows. Little hint of what's to come here. I hope you all enjoy that, because I have a feeling this is going to be one of those videos like the last capture video that's going to get 3 views, even though it's taking a gazillion hours of work. But stay tuned for that. Rent Optional wants to know if I could explain what's up with the limited run games NES carts that people say could slowly kill your console. And this is something that we've talked about in the past. I just wrote a post about it. I will be going into detail in next week's roundup. So I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I will just say that this is not a scenario in which you plug the cartridge into your NES, press power, and it dies. That is plausible for some of the terrible, like 50-in-1 NES carts I've seen in the past. And I think some of the much, much older 161-in-1 Neo Geo carts could absolutely have contributed to dead MVSs, although there's also a lot of other reasons those could have died. But this is not a case of you plug it in, power it on, and your console dies. This is it running improperly over long periods of time will kill your console faster. The two problems are, first of all, these consoles are over 30 years old, so you don't want to be putting any more stress on them than you possibly would, than you could, really. But the other part of it is this is a company that by no gray area should have known better. And not only should they have known better, they know that people love to hate them. And whether you agree with that or not is absolutely irrelevant to the point that this is something that could really throw a lot of trouble on their plate. This is something where they're not built properly. Period. End of story. Will it kill your console? I personally think there's a lot more things that would kill your console first. The number one would be buying those garbage, cheap eBay power supplies that say for NES. Yeah, those are horrible. Also, just trying to mod your console without discharging, so you whack it with bad static electricity. That is probably far more likely to kill a 30-plus-year-old piece of electronics that's always been used the whole time than this. But it's not going to kill it over time. And what you tend to see more often than not is you have people who understand how these circuits work saying this is bad. It's especially bad for a bigger company to do it. You should never have released a bad product. But then you have other people who have already bought products like this and who already spent the money, so they don't want to feel stupid, so that they just start arguing with you. Just like those people who originally bought the pound cables or the SCART to HDMI adapters or stuff like that. Those, I got a lot of hate from those people explaining why those products are terrible. And the only reason I got the hate is because their tiny little egos would explode if they realized, hey, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should have just checked first. So that's what we see a lot with stuff like this, is people losing their minds because, I bought it and it works, so you're just lying to sell something. What am I selling? What are any of us selling about that? So yeah, so basically, I'll go into more detail, but I'll leave a link to the post that has a link to the Retro Roundtable episode where Renee really gets in it. And that's not layman's terms, but I don't really remember that podcast too well, but I think I tried to bring it back to earth a few times. But it's a lot of smart people in that group. So, and then there's me just trying to get my everyman knowledge in here. So I'll leave a link to that. But yeah, just to calm everybody down, it's not an immediate thing, but it is absolutely a mistake that is worth your anger. It's not, this isn't one of those things where everybody's blowing it out of proportion. It's built wrong, and it will eventually kill your console if you use it all the time, because it's already an old beat up console anyway. So yeah, hopefully that's good enough for now. I'll talk about it a little bit more in the roundup next week, but the link to the post should help out. Well, that's it for this time. If you'd like to ask any questions, please just ask anything you'd like wherever you support, but please do it in the latest Q&A post, because the way the services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, as you saw today, I like just scrolling between the services and answering these questions as if we were hanging out somewhere having a chat. I like these to be really just laid back and chill. So any question you have, just wherever you support. And as always, thank you so much to everybody who supports in any way, because it really is you who's keeping all this stuff alive. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week.